One of the things you want to avoid in any job interview is to fall into a trap set by lazy interviewers. Welcome back to Interview At, where our mission is to help 100,000 job seekers just like yourself land their dream job. In this interview, we're talking to a relatively junior, we'll call it early career program manager who's targeting a job in technology. No specific company, they were just on the market looking for a job, applying to many different tech roles. And the categorization for the question asked would be best described as seeking to understand their level of ownership. The question asked was, tell me about a hard decision where the candidate made to sacrifice short-term gains in search of a longer-term goal or objective. One of the key things to listen to in this interview is the lack of brevity or the inability to use word economy to work through an answer, and how that's going to impact the candidate broadly, or you as a candidate, when you're dealing with a lazy interviewer. Because a lazy interviewer is going to do one thing. They're going to turn off their brain. They're not going to listen anymore. The hard part that you have as a candidate is convincing the interviewer, people like me, that you can do the job, you can do it there, you can do the role, and do it effectively. If you are speaking in a way that is poor communication or rambling or kind of not really direct and using linear storytelling, it's going to make it super hard on the interviewer to follow along and suss out, like, what questions can I ask? How do I get smart about this? Maybe I don't understand what they're saying. I don't know. But if you make it hard, they're just going to tune yourself out. Why do they do this? Well, it's very simple. The cost to me as the interviewer, personal cost, the personal equity cost inside the organization to stand up and say, yes, we absolutely must hire this person is really high, especially if I'm wrong and no one else agrees with me. It's really high. It's a big risk. The risk to me saying, no, we shouldn't hire them, they didn't meet my bar. It's really hard to kind of push back on that. Even if everyone else in the room is pounding the table saying yes, 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 yeah, that's one case where it might not work out so well for the person who just is lazy and didn't do their job. But if it's kind of a 50-50 ball or even a 70-30 ball, and you get a lazy interviewer and you didn't do a good job of explaining yourself, well, it's just not going to work out for you, because they're not going to expend personal equity saying we need to hire this person, because they just shut you off during the interview. They just tuned out and that was it. As with all these videos, I'll play back the mock interview as it happened and jump in with commentary along the way. And this one is within the context, time bias here for something more recent if possible, just because I want, as you progress through your career, especially in these interviews, I want you to focus on things that will better match to the scale expectations of the role that you're targeting. So in this one, try to focus on something a bit more recent if you can. But this is actually an important point, and I specifically called it out here because this is a more junior employee, but I want to be very clear. As the saying goes, dress for the job you want, not the job you have. Same thing with an interview, right? If you're targeting a job that's very much like your current job, like it's a lateral move, then you're probably fine using experiences that go back a bit further. But if you're targeting a more senior role, you're looking for a promotion as part of your job search, you really need to think about your story selection to make sure you bias more towards recency, or at least examples that are demonstrating that you can do the things that are expected of someone at that role. I want you to tell me about a time where you made a hard decision to sacrifice what would clearly be a short-term gain for a longer-term goal. While this candidate's taking a break and making their notes, which is totally fine, by the way, I'm going to jump in here and just highlight how this question maps to ownership. When you're talking about making a decision to sacrifice a short-term gain for a long-term goal, that's you as a candidate acting like an owner. You recognize that short-term gains, while great and awesome and fine, generally aren't in the best interest of an owner of the business, of having ownership in the business, the goal, the process, whatever it is. You're thinking long-term. You're understanding that long-term goals are more important than short-term gains. In general, it's important to note that this candidate, while they did take a long time, I just want to call out, you need to be aware of how much time you're taking to make your notes. It's fine to take a few moments to collect your thoughts, write a few bullets. This candidate, I edited out quite a bit of time, took a lot of notes and wrote a lot of stuff down. And for a more junior employee, this is fine. It's not going to kill your interview, but just something you need to be aware of, because these long breaks, long pauses act as conversation killers. They allow the mind of the interviewer to wander, and it just creates unnecessary blocks when you're trying to build a relationship with the person on the other side of the camera and the other side of the table. They're kind of wondering, okay, why is this taking so long, right? Can you communicate effectively? And this kind of, the longer it takes, the more it signals no.
So in my current job, in the initial time, I was handling customer complaints for almost 2 months. Um, it was very new from. I mean, the grocery division is very new division within e-commerce function. So everything is very small. Everything was very small at the beginning. So I'm just giving you context so that you can understand the kind of approval process, and the kind of execution is quite fast over here.
Just as a small point here, the candidate actually does a reasonable job of giving a sense of their responsibilities. I don't know in what role or capacity, whether they're a customer service manager or whatever, but that's something that you as the candidate can do a better job of. And I see this again and again in the mock interviews, people not speaking clearly at the front end of their answer. Because I don't, even though he says current company, what's his role? I don't assume that I have your resume memorized. Don't assume I, being the interviewer, have memorized your resume, your LinkedIn, whatever, and understand all of the different roles you've had at the different companies. Don't assume that. So it's okay to say, at my current company in the last 3 years when I was acting as the customer service manager and handling all of the inbound customer complaints. It's a sentence and a half, 2 sentences, but it helps set the context for what we're about to talk about.
So that you can take it into consideration. So I was taking care of complaints initially for 2 months, and I saw that we are having the second biggest reason for customer complaint is expired items. So expired items are getting delivered to customers, and this is one of the biggest problem in grocery business. So to give you an understanding, it's around 13% of total complaints that were coming from overall pool of complaints. So I jumped into this. I saw that what was the root cause, and there was some inbound issues, there was inventory issues, there was outbound quality issues. So I'm not going too much into details right now. I can get into it later, but after getting into the root cause, I saw some opportunity to bring out some changes in it. So my short-term goal was to make sure that within the same system, whatever we are having right now, how can we get the best possible expiry monitoring and monitoring system. So that was very quick, but I chose a different path where I had to design the whole new expiry system. So over here, I could improve the reports through which the fulfillment associate can get to know which item is about to expire, and they can clear it from the inventory. Okay, this was the short-term goal, and I can add some more manpower to do the same thing. I can make the inbound receiving policies more stringent to again make it to sustain in the same system and get control on the expiry. But I choose the longer term goal where I revamp the whole inbound process. Earlier, the inbound receiving used to happen on item level. I propose to change it on the batch level. So every food item, if you see anywhere in the country, in the world, is being procured or you can say produced based on the batches. So every batch is having their own expiry, their own batch number, at their own shelf life. So I propose to go with the batch system that can be linked with the ASN number, the PO number, and then the location where it will be put away, and then it's the SKU number. So all these 3 points get linked together, and it will at the same time expiry date as well, expiry date and the shelf life. So all these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 components will join together, and it will make a batch for that item. And in that case, it will be the best way to know which particular item at which particular location is having what expiry date, and through that we can monitor the best way possible, and we need lesser reports, lesser manpower for monitoring the same thing. So I proposed this thing. It took like almost 1 week to present it to the head director of the grocery, and 1 week to get approval from the product tag team over there. Although they created the whole system in almost 7 weeks to implement it. And now, not going into the details, ultimately, if I talk about the calculated matrices, the customer complaint decreased to almost 4% now. of the total complaints, which was a very, very
Say
big
that again?
achievement. From 13% to 4% of overall overall pool of the complaints. It reduced to that level because of the new process, because of we thought long term, and it took almost like 20 weeks to implement this new process of expiry monitoring and the revamping of the inbound process. And at the same time, the QC rejection was lesser for the expiry reasons. There were some uncalculated matrices also, like it must have increased the retention of the customer. It have increased the better supplier relation, because there was some agreement between the supplier that if item is about to expire, the supplier can take it. But without those very good information system, it was not possible. So that was the thing I like sacrificed.
So I let this answer, this part of the video run specifically to highlight this point, which is word economy is absolutely something that you as the candidate need to be thinking about. When you're laying out the parts to your story, the situation, task, the action, the result, there's a set of core questions you need to make sure you answer. If you watch any of my videos, I talk about this all the time. But in doing that, it forces you to structure your content in a way that is easy for me, the interviewer, to digest. I've never worked in an e-commerce environment, despite the fact that I worked at Amazon. I was on the Kindle team. I was on the e-commerce site. So I've never run an e-commerce site. I don't really understand the hard problems associated with food delivery, grocery delivery, as this candidate was walking through. And this candidate spent an awful lot of time highlighting kind of all the things that were happening, but I'm still, like, it could easily be boiled down to a handful of statements that the short-term game was to, well, we'll talk about that in a second, but that they had a situation where they had food that was expiring and they needed to revamp the system to rebuild how they were badging and locating the items so that they could make sure that they were more efficiently using their foodstuffs, because the number of complaints that they were getting in the system largely revolved around expired items. And in implementing this thing that they implemented, they had the ability to reduce their churn, or sorry, their customer complaints from 13% down to 4%. Right. So this was a hard decision where he sacrificed short-term goal, which was just kind of fix things as best you can, deal with it, versus long-term goal, which was rebadge the products so they could better deal with their warehouses. But this candidate spent a ton of time kind of walking through a bunch of minutia without really structuring this in a way that I, as an individual who maybe is a lazy interviewer, just kind of starts tuning out, right? It stops going from words to blah, 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 because it's hard to understand what's important. It's hard to know what part of this I need to pay attention to as the interviewer. And it becomes very easy to just tune out. Right. And so this is a case where this is a junior employee, so it's okay that there's some communication issues. That happens. The more senior you are, the more I would expect this to be solved. But I'm highlighting it here to make it very, very clear that this was a lot of words where a lot of words wasn't necessary, and that better structure absolutely would have helped this answer. And it kind of set the candidate up for challenges. Now, the short term versus long term, I'm still not clear what that was, and so that's kind of the follow-up question that gets asked here. I think I didn't quite understand the short-term element, though. What you said was that the goal was to make sure that within the system you could make sure that you were getting the best expiring monitoring system, but that's ultimately what you built. So I'm confused about what the short-term thing here was.
Let me just explain it again. I think I missed something.
Okay.
In the short term, in the current system, we were not adding expiry to any SKU. There were no attribute to any SKU as a surprise expiry date. So that was a miss from our side. We were just having a shelf life for each and every SKU.
Okay.
So we were not very good with the expiry monitoring system.
So when you think about what you as a candidate can do to help me, the interviewer, you should be clear what the trade-offs are, right? Especially if I'm unknowledgeable about your space. And this idea that shelf life as a proxy for expiration, right? That those are actually two different numbers was important, should have surfaced much earlier in the answer, because I, as someone who's only, not ever worked on an e-commerce site, wouldn't know this. And so it's not an uncommon thing for someone who's interviewing you to not have deep knowledge about what you've done. And so in some ways you have to act as a teacher to help me understand what's important, what's not. And when there's this many words that has been used to get to us to this point and this much time to get to this point in the interview, a lazy interviewer is going to tune out. They're just going to tune out, and it's going to be hard for you to recover. The short-term gain that you decided not to pursue.
So without adding the expiry date to any inbound item, we were able to capture that which particular item at any location is about to expire and clean it from the system or from the inventory, so that customer will not get it ultimately, or any picker in the warehouse will not pick it ultimately, and it will not get delivered to the customer. So that was one thing, and that was done through the shelf life data, not from the expiry data. So but now from the new process, I started adding the expiry date as well while doing inbound. So for that, the whole new system was built up, and it took more time. So I hope I'm answering now.
A little better. The addition of the shelf life piece adds the right context.
Okay. Can I give you like some example of any item so that it would better?
No. I understand. I get it now that you said the word shelf life. That helps in my brain set the context. But so how did you ultimately make the decision as to what the right thing to do here was? Essentially deciding between continue or implementing shelf life as a proxy or implementing expiration date, which was the actual metric. How did you, now that we've gotten to this point, I am specifically trying to get at from this candidate, do they use metrics, data, customer requirements? How did they make the decision? This is his time to shine, the time to give details that will help me as an interviewer understand why you made the decisions you made and whether or not you are consistently making good decisions. How did you ultimately make that decision as to what to advocate for?
How I made that decision?
Yep.
Yeah. So I studied some. I was talking to some of my friends who are working in grocery business in India. So I checked with them how they are managing their e-commerce grocery business, and especially this expiry thing. And then I got to know that they are doing some batch thing, and then something struck to me that with only self life, it won't be possible to monitor expiry tracking or to check that which particular item is having what expiry. So now combining with the self life and the expiry, we don't need manufacturing date. So if any item is having expiry of, for example, 10th of February, and the self life is 10 days, so it's like definitely the item got produced on the 1st February or the 31st of January. So the self life would be captured as a necessary attribute from the category team that was made necessary. So to precisely answer your question, I studied some models. I talked to my friends like how they are managing, and I discussed with my line manager that how we can make this whole system more robust. And I added some other attributes or some kind of, you can say, policies in the whole thing. And during the discussion with the product tech team also, I got more ideas that how we can incorporate the expiry in our flow in our inbound flow. There were some other issues or other things we got to know later on the later stage that that's not a part of this discussion, but we keep on updating our system. So yeah.
There's good and bad in this answer, right? Let's start with the bad. The bad is just, again, it's too long, too many words. And eventually the candidate says, well, to precisely answer your question, and then proceeds to speak more in kind of, had a nice, concise set of sentences, and then more rambling. That's the bad. The good here, it's actually not bad decision making. And for such a junior employee, it's surprisingly nuanced. And the fact that they leveraged their network and reached around to other folks in the industry, did research, studies, etc. This is all very high ownership, high dive deep categorization type work. This was actually really good and interesting to see, but the goodness is getting lost in the communication, and that's a real challenge for this candidate. How did you make the case to your leadership team that this was the right path?
Because I was working on this particular project, and I came up with this again study from the different firms that how they are managing, and uh, I brought all the case studies in front of them that how they are doing, and I didn't have the data that what is the percentage of the customer complaint they have uh, after implementing their system. But I knew that that system was more robust because many people from that company also are the colleagues of mine currently in my company. So I tried to create a model where the expiry date would not get detached with any item, even if that item is located at anywhere in the warehouse or in the fulfillment center. So that was the kind of USP of my model, that uh, item can be found out with their expiry date anywhere in the warehouse. And that's how it got kind of approved. And with the help of the product tech team, it got more refined. So yeah, so it
So in general, this candidate, junior level, I get it, and it actually did quite well from a decision making and thought processes and just raw intelligence. But their communication style definitely hampered their ability to deliver effectively on their answers within the context of this interview. Too wordy, not enough word economy, not direct, a little circular, and just not well structured, and not thinking through what are the questions that I, as an interviewer, are likely to ask as follow-ups to kind of probe at what you've said, isn't providing that information as it goes. And then even when the questions are asked, there's just a lot of words to then get to a summary statement, which is then followed by more words. It's making it really hard for me as the interviewer to understand what it is you're saying. So as for the assessment that I would have read into the room for this candidate, here we go. Ownership. Candidate is presenting as an interesting case. They are very good instincts, above level, and the issues on which they are working are similarly presenting as above level, but the presentation of the content is not very good. The lack of structure and stream of consciousness in the presentation of the content is causing too much fidelity and clarity to be lost. It is also preventing an interviewer from being able to ask intelligent follow-on questions. This is ultimately hurting the candidate and will hurt even more with a lazy interviewer. And the point there about the lazy interviewer is, again, as I've talked about in this video, they're just going to tune you out. They're going to stop listening. And that when they give up on you, when they flip that bit, it's really difficult to recover from that because you've now lost an advocate for you in the hiring loop process. They're not going to put their personal equity on the line to say, yeah, this is someone we need to hire, because they just were unable to pay attention because you didn't communicate well. And because of that, they can't formulate in their mind a case to make where they're willing to put their personal equity within the company on the line to say, yes, we need to hire this person, because the risk of that being a bad hire and coming back to them is too high. The risk of saying no and them not hiring you and just hiring from the additional pool of candidates, it's just a very different cost calculation for the interview. And it's just something you need to be aware of.